As you can tell from the overhead, I've denominated the word and the lesson today as always. And I am still on Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 through 5. This has been a multi-part study on anxiety, and so I'm still kind of camped out on this issue and this problem that so many people are confronted with, and just their anxiety about so many different things in life. And again, kind of as the headmark passage, it's Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. And it says, "Rejoice in the Lord always." I will say it again. Rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Okay, today is an object lesson, so I want you to take your fingers and put them up against your temples, just like this. And then I want you to offer this prayer. Thank you, Lord, for my amygdala. Thank you, Lord, for the 2 almond-shaped neural clusters that reside inside my brain, because I wouldn't be alive without them. And that's true. You would not be alive without your amygdala, or as we pluralize it, amygdalae. And thanks to your amygdalae, perhaps you stepped back on the curb when the car honked at you, maybe as you were coming here. Or you ducked your head when the baseball was headed in your direction. I mean, your amygdalae operate a lot like an alarm system. For instance, if an intruder were to break into a window or pry open a lock to your home, if you had an alarm system, your home security system would warn you, right? Bells would go off, alarms would go off, horns would go off, lights would turn on, basically telling you, get up, get out, and get safe. The system in your home actually alerts you before you even have time to think about it. And the amygdalae in our brains do the very same thing. Let me give you an example. We do not consciously think along these lines. Oh, I see a car coming. I'm in the car's way. The car is big, and I am small. The car is fast, and I am slow. I better move. I mean, we don't think that, right? The amygdalae prompt a reaction before we even know that one is needed. And when the amygdalae command, the rest of our body reacts. Our pupils dilate so that we can see better. We breathe faster, pumping more oxygen into our lungs. Our pulse rate increases, infusing more blood into our bloodstream. The adrenaline turns us into like Hercules. We're ready for this fight or this flight. We're suddenly faster and stronger and more alert than we were seconds ago. And we like our amygdalae to do the job that they were created to do. However, we do not like supersensitive or hypersensitive amygdalae. Again, for instance, we don't want a home security system that goes off at the gust of a breeze, right? Or if a dog barks, you don't want your home security system going off because of a dog barking. And we don't want that in our homes, and we don't want that in our heads. Perpetual anxiety is like amygdalae with an itchy trigger finger. They see a mole on the skin and all of a sudden conclude it must be cancer. They see a dip in the economy, all of a sudden conclude this must be a recession. Perpetual anxiety is like this mental alarm system in our heads that never, ever quite turns itself off. Now, I will say that limited amounts of anxiety is helpful. I mean, we need to be alerted to the dangers that are around us, right? What we don't need is to live in this constant state of high alert. And here's why. Because God created our brains to replenish themselves with natural mood elevators and tranquilizers like dopamine and serotonin. They restore this joy and peace to our lives. But if the amygdala inside of our heads never stops, the natural tranquilizers never have an opportunity to do their work. And as a result, the brain never resets. We become edgy, and we are constantly unsettled. And that, unfortunately, is the bad news. The good news is that God can calm this overactive amygdala. Paul urges us to rejoice in the Lord always. Philippians chapter 4, verse 4. Paul is saying always, not just on paydays, not just on Fridays, not just on good days or happy days or even birthdays, but to rejoice in the Lord always. And you and I are not the first to raise an arched eyebrow at the word in that verse, always. Because we know that somebody's going to say, yeah, right. That person kind of mumbling from their hospital bed as a patient awaiting surgery. Or, how can I rejoice always, says the unemployed dad. Or, really? Would be the question of a mother of a baby that was born with a disability. It's one thing to rejoice in the Lord when life is good, right? But when the odds are against you, well, I have an example for you from the Bible, and his name is Joseph. Because Joseph knew this challenge. And if you take a look at Joseph's story, it's basically a story of abandonment. His brothers had disliked his dreams and his swagger, and they decided to kill him and throw him in a pit. And had their greed not been just a feather heavier than their lust for blood, Joseph would have been a dead man. When they had the chance to sell him to some traveling merchants going along the way, they did. And his father was completely uninvolved. You would like to read in this story about Joseph where the father, the dad, heard about Joseph missing in action, running out to the last location he knew Joseph to be, try to find Joseph, ask thousands of questions to get his location, and then take him home. But we don't, because Jacob didn't. He was completely MIA. Joseph was carted off to Egypt and raffled off like a farm animal. The great-grandson of Abraham was sold to the highest bidder. Even so, Joseph landed on his feet. He worked his way up to the top, if you recall, of Potiphar's household. But then the mistress of the house put the hanky-panky on Joseph, and the lady went shady, and Joseph got out, leaving her holding his coat. And when she accused him of attempted rape, her husband took her side and tossed Joseph into prison. Joseph landed in jail for a crime he did not commit, and still Joseph didn't give up. He became this model prisoner. He made his bed, he made some friends, and made a good impression on the warden of the jail, who recognized Joseph as the inmate of the month and made him the convict in charge. Joseph met this butler while in jail and asked the butler to just simply remember him. The butler agreed, and then he quickly forgot, and cruelty then tips the scales against Joseph. Joseph languishes in prison for 2 years with no word and no solution. 2 years. That would be more than sufficient time to give up. Plenty of time for the world to turn gray for him, or that gargoyle of dread to kind of just creep into his mind. I mean, all these questions. Is this how God treats his children? I mean, is this really God's reward for good behavior? You do your very best, and this is what you get? You get a jail cell and a hard bed? If Joseph asked those questions, we really don't know. But if you do, and if I do, we're not alone. Now, you weren't thrown in jail like Joseph, but then again, maybe you were. I don't know. Or maybe you ended up in AA, or a woman's shelter, or an unemployment line. And you begin to wonder, I believe in a God, but is he aware that I exist? Does God even care? Deism says no. God created the universe and just simply abandoned it. Pantheism says no. Creation has absolutely no story or purpose to it at all. It's just a part of God. Atheism obviously says no, and not surprisingly, the philosophy that dismisses the existence of God will in turn dismiss the possibility of a divine plan. Only Christianity, on the other hand, says yes, there is a God. Yes, this God is personally and powerfully involved in his creation. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3 says, "The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word." You see, God is in charge of everything, even the details of your life and mine. He isn't making up his plan as he goes along. He didn't wind up the clock and just simply walk away. Daniel chapter 5, verse 21 says, "The Most High God rules the kingdom of men and sets over it whom he will." In Psalm chapter 75, verse 7, the psalmist says, "He executes judgment, putting down one and lifting up another." In Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 24, it says, "The fierce anger of the Lord will not turn back until he has executed and accomplished the intents of his mind." Those are some pretty starchy verbs, don't you think? God rules, God sets, God executes, God accomplished. Those terms attest to the existence of a heavenly architect and blueprint, and his blueprint includes you. In Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11, Paul writes, "In him we were also chosen, according to the plan of him who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will." Well, that's all well and good. But if God was really in charge, why was Joseph in prison? Or why is your friend's marriage coming apart? Or why does God permit challenges to come along our way? Or why wouldn't an almighty God prevent that from happening? Well, he wouldn't if it doesn't serve a higher purpose. Because do you remember the rest of Joseph's story? When Pharaoh was troubled by his dreams, the butler all of a sudden remembered his buddy Joseph languishing in prison. He mentions Joseph to the Pharaoh, and as fast as you can say providence, Joseph went from the prison to the palace. Joseph interpreted the Pharaoh's dream, which was basically a forecast of a coming famine, and Pharaoh promotes him then to prime minister. And Joseph successfully navigates the crisis and saved not only all of Egypt, but he ends up saving his own family as well. And years later, Joseph would tell his brothers in Genesis chapter 50, verses 20 and 21, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what he is now doing by saving the lives of many. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." Two words, church, at the heart of this passage reveal the heart of Joseph's providential hope. But God. You intended harm for me, but God. What was intended as harm became good. Why? Because Joseph kept God in the middle of his circumstances. Joseph viewed the sufferings of his life through the lens of divine providence. And frankly, we should all do the same. It's easier said than done, but Joseph could do it, and I think we can too. Because if we don't, anxiety is going to stalk your life every moment of every day. I don't have any words to counter the stress that is obviously being suffered by the atheist or the agnostic. I mean, what alleviates their anxiety? Yoga? Deep breathing exercises? Namaste. Or maybe some stress relief candles. I don't know. But God's sovereignty, on the other hand, bids us to fight the onslaught of fret with a sword that is etched with the words, "but God." The company is downsizing, but God is still sovereign. The cancer has come back, but God still occupies the throne. I was a jerk during the first years of my marriage, but God showed me how to lead a family. I was an anxious, troubled soul, but God has given me more courage. You see, church, the brothers in Joseph's story had every intention of harming Joseph, killing him first, and then trading him for money later. But God, in his providence, used their intended evil for God's ultimate good. He never robbed the brothers of their free will. God didn't intervene in the lives of Joseph's 11 brothers and cause them to change their mind. He didn't do that. God did not intervene in the free will choices that his brothers were making. He never imposed his nature upon them, but neither did he allow their sin and their sin nature to rule the day. And that's the point of the story. He rerouted evil into good. God uses all things to bring about his purpose. He will not be deterred in his plan to sustain and carry creation to its intended glory. And I will tell you that as we're leading up to Easter Sunday, next Sunday, the ultimate proof of God's providence is the death of Jesus Christ on the cross. No deed was more evil. No other day was so dark. Yet God not only knew of the crucifixion, God actually ordained it. As Peter told the murderers, and I've put it up there for you to read along with me, this man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. You know, church, everyone thought the life of Jesus was over. But God. His son was dead and buried, but God raised him from the dead. God took the crucifixion, those horrible, horrific, murderous acts of a Friday, and turned it into a celebration on a Sunday. And he can do the same for you, and he can do the same for me. And if I'm being just a brother amongst brothers and sisters here, I will tell you that I'm sorry for some of the pain that your life has given to you. I really am. I'm sorry if maybe your parents neglected you. I'm sorry if your teacher ignored you. I'm sorry if a heartbreaker said, "I do" on your wedding day and has said nothing other than "I don't" ever since. I'm sorry if you were inappropriately touched. I'm sorry if you were intentionally mocked or unfairly dismissed. I'm sorry if you ended up in your own Egypt. But if the story of Joseph teaches us anything, it's this: you and I have a choice. We can either wear our hurt or we can wear our hope. We can outfit ourselves in our misfortunes, or we can clothe ourselves in God's providence. We can cave into the pandemonium of life and lead these anxious-filled moments that we have left, or we can lean into the perfect plan of God. And we can then believe this promise, Romans 8:28. In all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And I'll conclude with this final example. This next picture is a picture of Horatio Spafford. Horatio was a very prosperous lawyer, and he was actually an elder in the Presbyterian Church. And in 1871, he and his wife, Anna, suffered some huge financial losses in that tragic fire that occurred in Chicago in that year. So in November of 1873, Anna and their children set sail for Europe with a group of friends to enjoy just a little time away. Horatio, on the other hand, stayed home to take care of some business, but he planned on joining his family later on. On December 2nd, he received a telegram from his wife that began, "Saved alone. What shall I do?" He soon learned that the steamer that his family was on had collided with a British vessel and had sunk. Their 4 daughters had drowned. And Anna was the only one of his family to survive. And so he left for England to bring Anna back home. And en route, while he's sailing on this ship, he wrote the lyrics to a song that would become an anthem to the providence of God. Words written by a grief-stricken man on a storm-tossed sea, whose first words of the first stanza begin, "When peace, like a river, attendeth my way, when sorrows ever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." And so, church, may we trust in God's providence in such a way that we can say the same. always. So we're going to sing the song that Horatio Spafford wrote under the most tragic of circumstances on a ship to retrieve a wife and bury 4 daughters. And despite those circumstances, like Joseph, could keep God in the middle of his circumstances and know that with God all things are possible. But God. Life sucks, but God. I've lost my family, but God. Where else can I go? And so from this prosperous attorney, serving as a church elder, to go to the depths of writing the song as he did at the loss of his daughters and the near loss of his wife, tells us something about a man who is dealing with circumstances in his life that were certainly far from perfect. And we come across those circumstances every day. I don't see any of you hovering out of church and skipping and whistling and saying zippity-doo-dah. Maybe you do, I don't know. I just don't hear it as you're leaving. But we all have those moments that create anxiety. But God. And Horatio Spafford wrote a song for that purpose. So if you have a prayer request or an announcement or something you'd like to share with us, now's the time to pass it up while we stand and while we sing this song.